Hi there, Jesse here. I am an Australian composer and sound artist, currently based in Adelaide, South Australia. A lot of my work is involved in the acoustic ecology and ecoacoustics disciplines, so considering environmental sound as both artistic resource for creative projects, but also investigating it from a science perspectives. Yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Hi, I'm Susan Campbell. I've lived in Fairbanks, Alaska for the past 32 years. I've had the great privilege of being a school teacher here. I'm also a poet and a book artist. And I make artist books and I incorporate original poetry in the artist books. And I often use natural objects from the landscape around me in those artist books paired with the poetry.
Hello, my name is Margot Klass. I also live in Fairbanks, Alaska, have been here since 2004. I'm a book artist and a sculptor, and I also use found objects in my work, many from the natural world, but also others that I find in junk markets and on beaches and wherever I am lucky enough to find something that resonates like that. I am very happy to be part of this Composing in the Wilderness program as an artist, working with Jesse and the other composers.
So a little bit about the inspiration for my piece, Silent Succession. I suppose it really begins with this idea of succession, which in ecology refers to the process of change in a species structure of an ecosystem or an ecological community over time. So you've got various kind of factors that influence that, particularly those of the environment, and that can influence the way that populations sort of shift over time, one kind of competing with another and then overtaking it, and then over time another species or population kind of coming to dominance. And so with that, whilst I was in Alaska, I kind of took note of all of the various aspects of succession at play, particularly as they kind of occur between different ecosystem types in that environment. So starting off with like a glacier and mountain landscape, and then transferring through to river systems, particularly the braided rivers, which were a key part of our experience being based on the Teplonica River, and then going through to the tundra. There were quite distinct changes that you could see at each point, and particular species that tended to dominate. So that became, I suppose, the way that I approached the structure of the piece, starting off with a soundscape that kind of inferred mountain regions or glaciers, and then coming through to river systems and tundra. But I was also interested in the idea that this process of succession could be disrupted, and particularly particularly through climate change in Alaska, much like the situation up there in South Australia, where I'm based. We have every summer worries about bushfires, which wreak massive amounts of devastation across the landscape. And just last year, not too far, maybe 25 kilometres from my home here in the Adelaide Hills, we had towns completely devastated that were just torn through. And massive numbers of homes lost. So it's a very real reality for us here. And from what I learned in Alaska in the decades preceding Composing in the Wilderness, when I attended, there were massive wildfires across the landscape there. So in that sense, the ending of the piece reflects on what the soundscape would sound like if that succession wasn't able to occur, and hence the title Silent Succession.
I think, Jesse, that both Susan and I responded to the apocalyptic aspect of your piece. And speaking for my piece anyway, I couldn't help but associate it with my medieval art background, where the apocalypse is everywhere in medieval cathedrals. And so when I wanted to respond to your work visually, I immediately turned to the Gothic cathedral, where you have everything, that magnificent space and all-encompassing life and nature. And then within that cathedral and within that space are little individual niches where saints or things, relics, for example, are honored and even venerated. So I made a kind of cathedral book that honored all of the aspects of nature that you mentioned in your score. And your score was really important to me, to see the notations that you made between the lines, because that gave me the cue to what you were thinking of, and then therefore what I thought of when I listened to the music. So within the niches are precious honorifics to, say, glaciers and permafrost and rivers, and there's a skull there representing the wildlife. There's a fossil, there's rock, and minerals, and all of those things juxtaposed with a very precious frame, such as an icon would have a gold frame behind it. So each niche had that kind of honoring of each aspect. And so that's the way I honored those aspects. And I think it would be interesting to hear how Susan did hers, because while we didn't talk about this in our process, it's related. So I'm going to pass it to Susan.
It was really interesting in that way, because Margot and I both responded, Jesse, to the notes that you had in your score and what you wrote in your program note. We've both worked in Denali as artists in residence, and we've spent time there and traveled there. So we, like you, felt that majestic, sublime space with that biodiversity. And then you're in your music and in your thought process to think about losing it to climate change, fire, earthquake, all these things that are impacting us in the modern world. I made an artist book and then made a box to house that book. And the box has drawers, and in the drawers are artifacts that, like Margot, and I didn't know she was doing this, to have artifacts that represent these things that could be lost. You know, I have stones and twigs and leaves and lichen and some bones and feathers, and those things that are precious to the flora and fauna. And then I wrote a poem asking questions of 21st century travelers, and what do we notice that's here? And in the artist book, it folds up in a panel, and I used a technique called pochoir. I cut my own stencils and used paint to make a landscape with braided river and mountains that was a place for that poem to live, and then it would fold up in the box. So it was wonderful when Margot and I shared our pieces that we both did something to honor the flora and fauna, and in a very reverent way, which we felt in your music at the beginning, that silent reverence. But then that when the apocalypse came crashing down, we still both hold hope that these things won't be lost. Yeah, especially as long residents here, how much we love this place and all the life in it. And I think you felt that being here when you were part of the Composers in the Wilderness.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of, I find it quite remarkable to see these like affinities between each of our responses. Obviously, myself with the music, and yourselves with the visual art. And one thing that kind of comes to mind in your case, Margot, it's kind of, you mentioned the relics aspect, and I was like looking at your work, it reminded me of a reliquary in that traditional yeah, the traditional cathedral sense, where it's like these precious objects that are housed for people to appreciate. And then for yourself, Susan, it was like a repository, almost like these drawers that you can pull out and kind of see these objects. But with that also, like we kind of each seem attracted to this idea of found objects and kind of working with materials from the landscape. It's not immediately apparent with the work, but a lot of the field recordings that I took and subsequently did computer analysis with influenced the kind of musical and pitch materials of the work. So the very opening of the work has this kind of almost whistle-like tone that comes through, and that's actually not air at all, but a recording of water that I made in Tatler Creek. There was this very kind of fine chute that concentrated the water through, so I put my hydrophone, which is an underwater microphone, directly beneath that stream, and it kind of produced that I think it's an A or an E that then became like the opening pitch that kind of gave life to the piece in a way. So the field recordings and the sound of the environment itself very much like a found object influenced the materials that went into the work. And subsequently, obviously, there's greater inclusion of broader soundscapes in the pre-recorded track.
In my piece, Jesse, I tried to include the soundscape, meaning music, and those extra sounds that you added by doing a gestural drawing of the score on the surface of the panels, so that in front of the panels where you would see the wall of the reliquary is a recording of my gestures that I made as I listened to your art. And that idea came from a very early childhood experience where my mother had us drawing to classical music as kids. And it seemed like a natural to include that. So it starts out with very delicate ink markings. It's almost like ischemic writing. And then it becomes violent as the music becomes chaotic. And then it whimpers out into that lovely, hopeful, optimistic sound of, I believe, is an airplane, meaning there is hope after the total destruction, if you will. And that that symbol of the circle at the end is that very hope of wholeness again. But I love the idea of those extra sounds in there.
I love the idea, and this is the first time I've heard it, since this is the first time that the three of us have had a conversation, that Jesse, you found sounds, and your found objects were your sounds that came into your music. And for Margot and I, we find objects and put them into the work. And so I find that very resonant between the three of us. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. The airplane's an interesting one because by and large, in a lot of the work that I do, there's this juxtaposition between what Bernie Krause calls the biophony, sounds of living organisms, and geophony, sounds of abiotic earth-based processes like wind and rain. So those two considered together, and then anthropophony, sounds produced by human technological and infrastructural activity, so traffic and the such. And so like they're kind of almost at odds given the impact that anthropophonic sound has upon more natural-based sound, if we call that, like prior to human industrial development. But here it's kind of, I don't know, it seems, as you said, Margot, kind of optimistic as to like there is still presence in that soundscape, but also like there's an observer role of like, look at what's been wreaked in a way. I don't know, that I like that there's this multiple interpretations of that in a way. I wasn't even sure when I included it. And then after that, it like that that water air sound comes through to kind of tie off the work. And there I was sort of thinking that yeah, in the sense of hope, there is a succession that will occur after this apocalypse per se. Like there's going to be some kind of ecological succession and a next step after all is yeah.
I'm really happy to hear that, Jesse, because I think both Susan and I went forward thinking that was your intention, but now that we hear you say it, it's great. Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe that uncertainty around the plane is, I don't know, some kind of tacit or a subconscious thing of like, there is uncertainty in these times of like what is going to happen, but ultimately holding out hope for a future hopefully better.
And I know Margot and I both loved that about your piece. And then being part of this, I think when we came to it, it was a challenge. Not being musicians like you, coming to music, how do you respond to it? And after this whole journey, I just feel very privileged and grateful to be part of this and to share that and to find out new things about it, even now, 3 years later, and that it's resonating in new ways for us, and then hopefully for people that come to view and listen to the piece and see the artwork. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you both for your responses. It's a real privilege to kind of see a life beyond like just an initial work and kind of see other people's responses to it, especially through a different medium. So thank you both so much for contributing your wonderful works to the exhibition.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.